Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Sonia Hilgren. I am president of the National Press Club and editor of Farm Journal. I'd like to welcome club members and their guests in the audience today, as well as those of you watching on C-SPAN, listening on National Public Radio, and listening on Internet, the global computer network. Before introducing our head table, I would like to remind our members of upcoming speakers. On Tuesday, May 21st, Sadaka Ogata, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, will present a speech entitled Return and Reconciliation, Healing the Wounds. On Wednesday, May 22nd, Tom and David Gardner, the motley fool of the online investing world, will talk about Wall Street's wisdom, why fools can't bear all this bull. And on Wednesday, May 29th, British Foreign Secretary Malcolm Rifkin will give a major speech on transatlantic relations. Transcripts and audio and videotapes of Press Club luncheons are available by calling 1-800-NPC-2334. If you have questions for our speaker, please write them on the cards at your tables, pass them up to me, and I will ask as many as time permits. I'd now like to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly when their names are called. From your right, Fran Lewin, assignment editor, CNN, and past president, Women's National Press Club. Elsie Carper, Washington Post, retired, and past president, Women's National Press Club. Sarah McClendon, McClendon News Service, and one of the first 24 members, female members of the National Press Club. Catherine Graham, chairman of the executive committee, Washington Post Company, and also one of the first 24 female members of the National Press Club. Betty Friedan, executive director and co-chair, Women, Men, and Media. David Hess, Night Rider Newspapers and past president of the National Press Club. Oh, I'm sorry. Forgive me. Vera Glasser, freelance journalist and past president of the Washington Press Club. Peggy Robertson, freelance journalist and chair of the National Press Club Speakers Committee. Don Larrabee, past president of the National Press Club. I want to insert a little note here that Don and two other people in the audience, Bob Alden of the Washington Post and Bill Hickman, were three of the people who really were instrumental in admitting women into the National Press Club. Nancy Woodhull, co-chair, Women, Men, and Media. Ron Sarrow, news director, Washington News Network, and first male president of the Washington Press Club. Susan Garland, Business Week magazine, and the final president of the Washington Press Club. Frances Spass Slayton, Metro Sunday Group author and one of the first 24 female members of the National Press Club. Hope Ridings Miller, author and Washington Post, retired. Our speaker today has been on the front line of a legion of women journalists, many of whom you've just met, who paved the way for other women to take and excel many of the thousands of jobs in journalism once virtually closed to them. We salute them and join in celebrating the 25th anniversary of the admission of women to the National Press Club. Helen Thomas, also one of the first 24 women admitted to this club 25 years ago, is a Washington institution, is almost as much of an institution as this club itself. Most television watchers know her as the woman who asks the first or second question at presidential press conferences. That's because it's traditional for correspondents from major wire services to ask the first questions. And Helen Thomas has been White House bureau chief for United Press International since 1974. She also is the one who ends presidential press conferences with a polite, "Thank you, Mr. President." She was born to Lebanese immigrant parents in Winchester, Kentucky, the seventh of 9 children, and grew up in Detroit and was graduated from Wayne State University. She began work in the summer of 1942 as a copy girl for the old Washington Daily News. The next year, she joined United Press as a radio writer. Arriving at work at 5:30 a.m. each day, she developed a habit which no doubt has contributed to her success. She's early to rise and late to bed. She still is the first reporter in the White House press wing each day and the last one out. She covered Jacqueline Kennedy when John Kennedy was president and has traveled the world with Presidents Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton. She was the first woman officer of the National Press Club, the first woman to receive the club's 4th Estate Award for Lifetime Achievement, the first woman to be admitted to the prestigious Gridiron Club and to serve as its president, the first woman president of the White House Correspondents Association, and on and on and on. In 1959, she was president of the Women's National Press Club, which became the Washington Press Club when it admitted men before the National Press Club admitted women. The two clubs merged more than a decade ago. Helen also was a part in one of the great Washington love stories. Douglas Cornell, the big story man for the Associated Press, was Helen's friend and colleague, eventually the love of her life. In 1971, the year Cornell retired and was no longer her competitor, their romance became very public. Richard Nixon gave Cornell a surprise farewell party and invited the entire Washington press corps. Pat Nixon grabbed the microphone and announced their engagement. It was one of the few times anyone scooped Helen Thomas at the White House. And her husband, sadly, died 11 years later. Before Helen speaks, she is to receive another award. I'd like to ask Betty Friedan and Nancy Woodhull, co-chairs of Women in Media, please join me at the podium to present a Breakthrough Award. Founded in 1987, Women, Men, and Media hosted a roundtable discussion here at the Press Club this morning to discuss news coverage of women in power. Betty Friedan is known to all of us as the author of The Feminine Mystique and several other groundbreaking books. She is now Distinguished Visiting Professor at Mount Vernon College here in Washington. Nancy Woodhull was a founding editor of USA Today. She is the Executive Director of the Freedom Forum Media Studies Center in New York, an op program of the Freedom Forum, where she is Senior Vice President. Betty and Nancy.
Helen and I were evidently twins in another life. Since I've been living in Washington, cab drivers say, "Oh, I love that question you asked at the White House." And she gets into airports and say, "Oh, you've done great things for women." Well, she has done great things for women. It was Women, Men, and Media that thought that should celebrate its anniversary this way. We give Breakthrough Awards, Women, Men, and Media. We monitor, for 8 years now, we have been monitoring the representation of women in the mass media as a sort of Rorschach test of what's happening in society. And while we still see a glaring deficiency in the sense that women, who are 52% of the population, make up only 15% of news coverage, if you look at the front pages, that had grown toward 20% and then it slipped down in the last 2 years. Nevertheless, there have been massive strides made when you look back the 25 years that we're looking back to today. And we are giving this Breakthrough Award to Helen because she led the battle. She led the battle to take women out of the balcony and into the full participation in the press club and in the coverage of power and politics in Washington. And that's that step was very important. That inclusion of women as puppets Fran Lewin gave me today some historical records. It said that as late as September 28, 1970, saying it would severely alter, if not destroy, the character of this institution, the Press Club, by women. Well, I hope it has beautifully altered, you know, and protected from obsolescence the admission of women into full citizenship in the press corps. That's very important, that the eyes and the experience of women and not just men define the news, report the news, cover the news. It is a real breakthrough in the unfinished movement of women to equality. And you are a heroine in this. You're a heroine in this. You are a heroine. And if we have broken through the feminine mystique, the definition of women just in sexual relation to men, just as wife, mother, sex object, housewife, and the person, defining herself in her own actions in society. If we have moved to the affirmation of the personhood of women, and therefore to an altered human society, an evolved human society, Helen Thomas is a heroine of this, and we are so happy to present the Breakthrough Award. Nancy will read you what it says.
Let me read this for Helen Thomas in recognition of the many breakthroughs you've made during your distinguished career in journalism and for your leadership in opening doors for women throughout the profession and here at the National Press Club. Congratulations.
And now I want to officially present my former colleague at UPI, Helen Thomas.
Well, it's always hard to hear your obituary. And I was only one of the wild women who tried to get into this club. There are so many, and I should not get the credit in any way for it. I was simply one of the screamers. I have a couple other words for it, but thank you, Madam President. I've always wanted to say that. Good afternoon to all of you. I'm very honored to be here to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the admission of newswomen to the National Press Club. On that memorable day in 1971, the all-male club saw the light and voted 227 to 56 to take in women reporters as members. Of course, I am just a surrogate today for all the wonderful women at this head table, on the floor, and those who've passed on, all who fought the good fight for access to the news. The National Press Club was organized in 1908, mainly as a men's social club, a convivial hangout where they could drink, smoke, gossip, and presumably pass on news tips. As time went on, the club became recognized as an elite press forum in Washington where government officials, foreign dignitaries would make their major news announcements. Women reporters were left in the cold from these events, could not cover these news-breaking affairs. And it was to be many, many years later for the club to bite the bullet. But we must remember that women did not get the vote until 1920. It still outrages me. And only after the suffragettes had marched, chained themselves to the White House fence, and went to jail. We didn't quite do that, but we agreed with the motto of those valiant women: failure is impossible. Once newswomen were determined to seek equality at the workplace, it became our cause célèbre in Washington, and we took the problem to the highest office in the land. But a lot of history was made before that occurred. In 1919, 28 women journalists formed the Women's National Press Club. And as the years went on, the Women's Press Club began to give their counterparts, this club, a run for its money and competed for the top-ranking personalities to speakers. The Women's Press Club took in an honorary member in the early 1930s who was a legitimate journalist, Eleanor Roosevelt, who wrote a syndicated column daily entitled My Day. Learning of the plight of the women reporters, Mrs. Roosevelt held regular news conferences in the White House, but only women reporters. What's more, she made news getting her information from none other than FDR himself. And as she began to make news in these sessions, editors began finally to realize that they had to hire more women reporters. And she even gave these women a scoop that prohibition was on its way out. Well, you can imagine what they wanted to do in the bar on that one. Incidentally, photographs of those news conferences do grace the walls, some of the walls in this club. It's sad to say that women reporters got their biggest breaks during World War II. During the two world wars, when every young man who could breathe, if he had a pulse, he was being drafted. And after World War II, short-sighted editors, with none of that vision thing, began firing the women who had covered the hard news beats here, including the White House and Capitol Hill. And they assumed that the GIs would want to return to their $25 a week jobs. Wrong. Nobody used the euphemism then, but the women reporters were downsized. And eventually the newsrooms became all-male bastions again. In 1949, Florence Chapman succeeded in swimming the English Channel in both directions. In that same year, the press club redid its bar, and women visitors were allowed to file through, not to order a drink, on this one-time basis. At the bar stood Homer Dodge, a club curmudgeon, if courtly, who wore pearly gray spats. Well, you get the picture. Dodge was moodily staring into his partly consumed beer when suddenly he announced in stentorian tones, "A woman's place is English Channel." Well, Dodge, it seems that his anti-woman misanthropic attitude toward women stemmed from his childhood in Cleveland. It seems his mother was a secretary to a big oil man. And when she hit the boss up for a raise, he offered her stock instead. She refused and insisted she wanted the money. As Dodge used to tell the story, that oil man was John D. Rockefeller. And he bemoaned the fact that if his mother had taken the stock, he wouldn't have to work a day in his life. Well, women were not welcome in the bar, to put it mildly. But one day, a well-dressed woman, beautiful hat, came to the club, briefcase in hand, and demanded to see the bar. And she was told, rather politely, by the president of the club, that it was for men only. And when she informed him that she was chairman of the ABC board and she could refuse to renew the club's liquor license, he changed his tune. She got a special escort into the bar. In 1955, Sarah McClendon made her move, sponsored by two brave male members, and she filed an application to join the National Press Club. We're still looking for that application. Time marches on, and she got in 16 years later. So who's counting? A year later, Liz Carpenter, who headed the Women's National Press Club, made a deal with the men's club, and women reporters could sit in the balcony during the press luncheons. But it was stipulated at the time that they had to be escorted to the fire exit steps to the balcony and be escorted out of immediately afterward. Well, the balcony became a metaphor discrimination against women. It was the back of the bus. And the only consolation was that they could look down on their male colleagues. Well, columnist Mary McGrory used to get to the balcony early, and she used to brown bag it. And when there was another breakthrough and women were finally allowed to sit on the floor for special luncheons, Mary was asked how she liked it. The food was better in the balcony. Competition by all the press clubs began to get hot and heavy, and by the time the era of coexistence rolled around, President Eisenhower invited Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev to Washington while the fur began to fly. All the clubs sent cables to Moscow inviting Khrushchev to have him appear at their luncheon, a luncheon they would sponsor. The State Department insisted that this press luncheon, the one that he would give in Washington, be held at the National Press Club. With the help of the Russians and the State Department, however, the National Press Club reluctantly relented and decided that it would allow 1.4 women, whatever that means, to every 10 newsmen to attend the historic luncheon. Well, as it turned out, 33 women reporters were allowed to sit in 120 seats. And they had to fill out forms, however, explaining their need to cover the event. Well, that was the speech when Khrushchev told us, "We will bury you." The date was September 16, 1959. After that, the Cold War continued, and so did the ban on women becoming members. It was well worth noting that black journalists did not fare well either. Joe Layton, formerly with UPI, formerly the voice of the Pentagon, Deputy White House Press Secretary, recalls that when the Newspaper Guild staged its front page ball at a downtown hotel in 1943 during World War II, when blacks, of course, were serving and dying, black members were not allowed in the hotel, not allowed to attend the dance. A year later, when the Guild wanted to stage another ball, Layton approached the National Press Club, and he shamed them into agreeing to permit the ball to be held in the club ballroom. But the club management made him promise that black male members would not be permitted to dance with white women, and that members of the Guild had to be informed of this in advance. Well, somehow, Layton just didn't get around telling the Guild members of this Faustian deal he had made, and that he would have been forced to agree to. And the dance went on without a hitch. Good time was had by all. The National Press Club unwittingly became the first institution in the South to hold an integrated social affair. Well, in the 60s, the Women's Press Club hit its stride, and it commanded top newsmakers. Senator Margaret Chase Smith announced before that club that she would seek the presidency. But the National Press Club was still a favorite spot for the government officials. And when Lyndon Johnson asked an aide why the officials continued to go there instead of Sans Souci, the aide replied, "Mr. President, it's the only place in town where they can go without being overheard by a journalist." Well, the advent, of course, of the women's movement led by Betty Friedan helped create the atmosphere that led the National Press Club into the 20th century. And women reporters had argued all along that if it was a social club and not a professional club, then the one press event involving a visiting head of government should not be staged at the press club. They were let up in the pressure that women journalists put on Washington officialdom to steer clear of the press club lectern, and protests began to pay off. By this time, what I like to call the men's liberation movement also began to take hold with this club, and members no longer could really justify the gender exclusivity. And there were holdouts, of course, and one member complained, first it's the tap room, then the billiard room, then the card room, and eventually it will be the men's room. Well, meanwhile, the Women's Club began to take in male members and became the Washington Press Club in 1985. But 25 years ago, when 24 women were first admitted to the club, the president was hardly the soul of gallantry. He told the women who were coming in, perhaps your names will be added to the list. Joan of Arc, Amelia Earhart, Carrie Nation, Pocahontas, and Lizzie Borden. For all that, Sarah, Fran Lewin, many others could belong to the White House Correspondents Association, but we were barred from going to its one event of the year, a dinner in honor of the President of the United States. Well, this was finally unacceptable. We went to President Kennedy and told him he should not attend the White House Correspondents' Dinner if we couldn't go, and he agreed. And of course, then we all went to the dinner. women were allowed to go for the first time in 50 years. Since those glory days, the National Press Club has had 5 women presidents. And even today, we search for the answers to blind prejudice that so long ruled our society and was so damaging to our profession and many others. Our profession particularly because we hold the public trust. We do not look back in anger. It all seems so bizarre. And once we walked into the club as members, we were accepted, and it seemed so right. So having overcome some of these obstacles of the past, we have more mountains to climb. We must work to restore faith in the integrity of our profession, its essential fairness, its independence, its profound dedication to the truth. Thank you.
Helen, could you tell us what was the most difficult question you have ever had to ask a president?
The most difficult was when I became bureau chief at the White House in 1974. Was the height of the Watergate revelations, and press conferences were very few and far apart. President Nixon, we knew, was on the rope. We knew it was darkness at noon, and we knew the other shoe was going to fall. But I also knew, we all came to the one press conference at prime time that he was holding, and we knew what a strain it was on him. But that night, he started his press conference by announcing, by congratulating me on my appointment. And I was in a dilemma because I had come armed with a very tough question. Here, the president was being so nice to me. So I thought to myself, what is the public going to think? They think, well, that woman, she is so ungrateful. And then I thought, what will my peers think? That flattery will get me everywhere. I asked a tough question, but I must say I had a lot of qualms about it. Felt bad.
What was the question?
It was a question on one of the tapes with John Dean.
Of all the presidents you have covered, which one, in your view, has done the most for women?
Lyndon B. Johnson, without a doubt. I think he really promoted women in a big way. I think all of the presidents really have tried to do a lot for women. President Clinton has several women in the cabinet and everything. I think we've made incredible strides in that direction, or women cabinet officers and so forth. But, and I really do think that we'll have a woman president early in the next century. It isn't a question of them having done for us. We've done, as far as I'm concerned, it isn't their role. We should have had equality from our date of birth. I can't understand why we had to wait so long, and I can't understand any woman who would not fight for equality totally until we get it.
Who is your favorite president?
Well, I thought that President Kennedy was the most inspired president I covered. I think that he had a sense of destiny. I think he had a feeling that his time was short. I think he understood where the country should go. He had come out of World War II. The very fact that anyone would say right out of science fiction, we're going to land on the moon in a decade. He didn't live to see it, but we did it. He went for the first nuclear test ban, Peace Corps, and he always told young people to go into public service. It was always very inspiring. I mean, I know all the other things that are supposed to make up his presidency, but in that respect, I think that he understood what the public trust was.
And who is your favorite First Lady?
Believe it or not, I think all of them sort of were afraid of us and maybe even hated us, and I admired all of them that I covered. and I think that every one of them rose to the occasion. It must have been with great fear and trepidation. They knew they were being judged. They knew they couldn't sit there. As Fran would say, they had 10 maids and 10 mops. They couldn't just sit there. They had to do something, and each one made a fantastic contribution, I believe.
Hillary Clinton has had difficulty protecting her zone of privacy. It's been seen as stonewalling. How realistic or unrealistic was that desire in this era?
Well, Mrs. Roosevelt said you can have a lot of privacy in the White House if you don't do anything. I think that if that becomes your number one qualification, you should never run for the presidency. I think they have a lot of privacy, some maybe too much. It seems to me that White House has been called a prison, a great white museum, and so forth. I think that more good, wonderful things happen to them. Muriel Humphrey was once asked why she wanted to be First Lady. She never made it, but she said, because I can wave a magic wand. And it's really true. If a First Lady shows any interest in anything, the world will be the path to her door, especially if it's for good.
Do you know how Martha Mitchell got your telephone number in the, not just your regular number, but your telephone number in the Board of Governors room at the National Press Club when you were the first woman officer, and called you several times during board meetings to give you scoops during the Watergate era?
She was a great newswoman.
If you were Mike McCurry, the president's press secretary, what changes would you make in your interactions with the press?
I think that he does a very good job. I do believe that he has the entree that he needs and so forth. I asked him at this, he was at this podium, I think, when I asked him if he would ever lie to us. And he said no, but he would tell the truth slowly. And so I thought maybe we could tell him to tell the truth faster.
Each president seems to hold fewer and fewer news conferences, going back all the way to Roosevelt. Will this trend ever turn around?
Presidents hold news conferences when things are going well. I can assure you they go underground when they're not going well. President Clinton does not really hold, I think he's held a couple primetime news conferences. He holds more news conferences than you think, but they're sort of hit and run, and they're not these highly staged events in the East Room. So I think that most presidents at some point do want to bypass us. We are really a thorn in their sides, but we always put the pressure on, and I think that we'd rather get it from the horse's mouth. We'd rather have a president every week talk to us for the validity of the answers. So you can't force them. There's nothing in the Constitution that says a president has to hold a news conference. On the other hand, it's absolutely indispensable in our system, in our democracy, that a president be questioned and held accountable. And we're the only ones. We're the only institution in our society that can do that on a regular basis.
Would you ever hold back and not ask a question? And if so, what would cause you to do so?
Well, I have a pretty good record of not holding back. So I think that I would ask the questions I felt had to be asked. Tough as it is, I believe that we have a lot of power in a sense. We're not there to ruin reputations or lives. We're there to find out the truth. And I think when people go into public service, they do hold, they are accountable, and they have to be questioned, and I think they understand that. That goes with the turf today.
Who, in your opinion, was the most effective press secretary in terms of understanding the press?
None. No, I'm teasing. There were some better than others. I thought that I suppose I once thought that if they came up through our ranks and had that kind of experience, they would be good press secretaries, but it wasn't necessarily so. I think Pierre Salinger was very good. He was very close to the Kennedys. He knew what was going on in the Oval Office. I thought Marlon Fitzwater was very good. We had Camelot with Jerry Tahorst. He lasted 1 month. And I think Marlon certainly had the entree with President Bush, and especially during the Gulf War, he was tuned in. And that's what has to happen, and I think McCurry does a very good job.
You sort of answered this question, but how would you characterize this White House as far as its relations with the press and accessibility of top officials? So those would be people besides McCurry.
Well, it's improved a lot. They really came in, Clinton entourage came in with a real chip on their shoulder. And usually it takes a couple days to get arrogant, get in the White House, and find your way around. Well, they came in arrogant, but something 20, something 30. It's great on a campaign trail. They have the energy, they have the enthusiasm, but they can't run the world. So there was a lot of hostility, and I think a lot of baggage, and a lot of it probably stemmed from very valid reasons from the campaign, where they felt they had been given a very tough ride. But it's improved a lot, and I think that when Mike McCurry came in, he realized that he had to clear the atmosphere. And he basically really told his staff that we were human beings, not beasts, as we've been called. And so we've had a better relationship. It's never perfect. We do fight.
How has television news changed coverage of the White House? Have you seen TV reporting get better or worse throughout the years?
I have the greatest admiration for my television colleagues, because I've seen them come in 6 o'clock in the morning, work 12 hours to get a minute and a half on the nightly news. That is truly nirvana. I see less and less TV news, not enough, and they actually have to sell their stories now to their editors. There's no question that television has transformed journalism, especially at the White House. We do take second place, but no one can blame a president for not going on television and reaching 60 million people all in one fell swoop. And I certainly don't resent it. I want people to see with their own eyes and to be able to make their own judgments. So I think it's great, but I think it must be very sad for them, because they do cover these stories and they get so little chance to tell them. There ought to be more news on television.
Do you think journalists should accept fat speakers' fees?
Yes. Why not?
You want more news on television. Do you support the efforts of the networks to have more political coverage this year? Do you think they're doing enough of it, having it, say, in off prime time, or each network's doing it differently?
If they give free time, I think it's wonderful. I mean, imagine the megabucks it takes to run for public office in this country. And I think the whole idea of them being a little more magnanimous and giving time is absolutely necessary. Used to be that they had to give something to the public service. Certainly radio did, but those days seem to have gone by the board, so I'd like to see it happen.
Senator Dole is leaving the Senate to run for president full-time. Is that wise in your opinion?
I honestly don't know. I'm as thunderstruck as everybody else in town. I guess he's a man who is very an independent thinker. He certainly knows what he is, why he is, and so forth, and I'm sure that his judgment came out of a lot of long thoughts. So obviously he thinks that's the best way to go, and we have to bow to his judgment.
UPI has been placed on life supports many times. Do you expect it to survive for the long term?
Forever. we As Samuel Johnson said, we live from hope to hope. All the time we've been on life support, we've seen many newspapers, great newspapers in this country, go down the drain. I mean, I can name them, 10. And so it's always a sad day for us when any paper goes down. And so far, I think we're holding our own. And I hope we do survive, because I think it's important. Competition is our lifeblood, and I think you need it in wire services.
Who at UPI had the courage to appoint you White House Bureau Chief so early in the fight for equality? How did that happen?
Well, it was a great National Press Club member by the name of Grant Dillman, and he was a woman's liber somehow, some way, and it was very, I always wanted to be a reporter. It wasn't a question of being a bureau chief, and of course I think that the White House beat is covering history every day. I'm very privileged, very fortunate, and I was very lucky to have him as boss.
Why are there not more female bureau chiefs in Washington?
Well, there are quite a few, and the why comes from the whole mores of our society. I mean, we have come a long way, but I think there is a way to go. And I think that women more and more, you're seeing many more at the White House compared to the handful when Fran and I were covering. So I think they're making great strides.
What has been the biggest struggle you have had as a woman journalist?
Well, you know, I've never thought of it as a struggle. I just thought of it as, I've been a woman's liber since the day I was born. I always thought that inequality was injustice, and I've always fought against that. So it became kind of a way of life. You should always fight. You should be outraged when things are unjust in our society, because we should always try to move to make it a better world. And so the struggle was for all of us. Every woman here, there isn't one woman in any profession, medicine, law, and so forth, you name it, who hasn't faced that kind of discrimination is wrong.
What sort of advice do you give young women today who want to pursue careers in journalism?
Go for it. You will never regret it, and those who've left it have always looked back in longing.
What should women do to break into senior ranks of journalism?
Live. A long time.
Besides time, what are the major barriers remaining to women becoming top news executives, and how can these barriers be overcome?
Well, I think Nancy can better answer that. Of course, there is the glass ceiling in our profession, as there is in so many others, and I think that women just have to keep excelling, keep fighting, and stay on the road. I think that men are becoming more and more aware of that women have the talents and they can do anything, and especially for a long time, you know, they wouldn't make the vice presidency. They'd get a crystal vase instead whenever they made a sale. But those times are changing. I really do think that we're going to be there at the top.
To what quality of yours do you owe your success? And did you have a mentor?
I don't think there's such a thing as success. I mean, you're only as good as your last story in my profession. I think that my adrenaline is outrage, and I think I had a lot of determination, and I think you should always set goals and strive for them. I don't know. And as for my mentors, my parents, really. I never had a role model per se in journalism, but my parents gave me this tremendous sense of what right and wrong, of how to really live a good life.
Besides those qualities, could you describe some other necessary talents? No, the necessary talents to being a good journalist.
You got to be very nosy. You got to be very energetic. You certainly have to be enthusiastic, curious, and you have to be willing not to work 9 to 5. I mean, you really have to be devoted to the truth. I know how that may sound, but it's true.
You have worked beyond traditional retirement age. Are you planning never to retire? And what career goals do you have for the next decade? Do you plan maybe to write another book?
Well, if elected, I will serve. I have no retirement plans. I would like to write another book if I can apply the seat of the pants and get down to work and so forth. Yes, I will write another book.
I think you've got some buyers out there. Did women your age who did well in journalism have to make personal sacrifices, such as foregoing children?
Well, I got married so late in life that it was not convenient to have children to speak of. I think that there isn't any reason why women can't have it all. They can't have careers, have families, and so forth. But it's tough. It's tough, and obviously women are doing it today. I mean, 3/4 of the women do work, and they do have families, and they manage. No one said it would be easy. It's always good to marry the right man who'll be very helpful and who will be there when you need them and so forth. But it's a very strange question because I don't see why they can't have it all.
If you had not been a journalist, is there another career you would have pursued?
The stage.
What has your career taught you about human nature?
Here to stay. People are very good, people are very kind, and I've always been amazed at the goodness all around me.
Who do you think will be the first female U.S. president and when?
You tell me.
Who do you think will be the next president to occupy the White House?
Well, President Clinton was declared politically dead in 1994 when the Republicans swept the Congress, and most of the pundits said he's finished, he's a lame duck for 2 years. And now I think he has a chance, but the Republican candidate also has a chance. Is that fair?
How did you get your first news job, and what was it like to work in UP Radio?
I got a job as a copy boy for $17.50 a week in Washington on the old Washington Daily News, and I thought I had arrived. And as for the radio job, I did go to work at 5:30 in the morning, and I'm still going to work at 5:30 in the morning.
Can you name the names of some of the men who voted against admitting women into the National Press Club?
I wouldn't think of it. Or them.
To follow up on your question, that reporters, or your answer that reporters should accept fat speakers' fees, what about the argument that taking money from groups that you cover be an apparent conflict of interest?
Never has been with me. I don't think that we're co-opted because we speak to a group. Anybody want to sell me anything here? I mean, I think that's a ridiculous argument. It really puts a cheap price on any individual.
We know that you married your AP competitor. How did your friendship with Fran Lewin survive when you were cutthroat rivals at the White House?
Best friends.
Please share some of the tactics you and your colleagues used to get the National Press Club to admit women.
Blood, sweat, and tears. Actually, all of these women put the pressure on the Washington officials. We embarrassed them. We shamed them. We really did everything we could, I think, in a very legitimate way. And I think that any tactics at that point would have been legitimate because we were really determined. And I do think that it helped to really make presidents feel embarrassed. I remember once when the president of Venezuela came to the White House, and we had begged him, as the Women's Press Club, not to appear at the National Press Club because it was segregated. But he decided to go ahead anyway. So when Kennedy escorted him to the door of the West Wing, and Kennedy said, "There is one of the women who's been fighting against you going to the press club." And so I said, "Well, we forgive you officially, Mr. President." And Kennedy said, "But not personally."
These speakers' fees questions keep coming, Helen. If you can't be bought, why do we fear that politicians will be co-opted? Aren't they as trustworthy as the press?
Not really.
Are you really the last person out of the press office at the White House every evening?
No.
Judith Martin, Miss Manners of the Washington Post, covered the vote to admit women to the club from the balcony. She and other reporters were invited to the bar for a drink after the vote, so therefore she wasn't yet Miss Manners, but Miss Manners was one of the first women to go to the bar. How long after you were admitted to the press club did you go to the bar?
I can't remember. That wasn't our goal. In fact, it was such a base canard and used against us. I remember when women were first allowed into the club as members, I guess some women did go into the bar, and one of the, I guess it was Homer Dodge, or one of them again, one of the old-timers who said, "Well, now I can't say a certain cuss word," to which one of the women reporters rattled off a blue streak of profanity to show him, yes, he could.
How long do you think it will be before women outnumber men in membership in the press club?
Well, that isn't the goal, and I don't think that's important. I think it's very important that everybody who wants to go into our field get there.
Can a woman who leaves journalism to make more money in public relations or in government ever return to the newsroom with credibility?
They do all the time, absolutely. Why not? Public relations has high standards of ethics, too, or they're supposed to have. I don't see any reason why not.
Some people say that more women are being hired in news organizations because they will work for lower salaries than men. Is that true?
You'll have to ask the men that. I don't think that that's exactly right. I think salaries are coming up to par now in all newsrooms. I think UPI has always paid men and women alike in the same category.
Before we ask the last question, Helen, we would like to present you a certificate of appreciation and a mug for when you get up at 5:30 in the morning, and to thank you very, very much for...
I don't get a tie?
No. We gave up giving ties here a long time ago. So we'd like you to use that mug to help wake you up in the morning, but you must be one of these people who just wakes up immediately. Surely you don't have trouble getting up in the morning.
Yes, I do. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And the final question. Did a president ever break your heart, either through his behavior or mismanagement, and who?
Break my heart? No, not really. Disappointment? Sure, they all do, but don't they for all of us? They don't exactly do what we want them to do, every time.
Can you stand with me? Thank you very much, Helen. Thank all of you for coming today. I'd like to thank staff members Melissa Bender and Chad Taylor and Melanie Abdu-Dermont and Howard Rothman for organizing today's luncheon. And I'd like to thank all of the past presidents of the National Press Club and the Women's National Press Club and the Washington Press Club and all the women who were early members of the club and all the men who helped the women get in. Thank you very much.